This is part 4 of the Unit 2 review lecture. This will focus on species interactions, their different roles, their different niches inside of an ecosystem. One of the first things that we were talking about in this unit is how ecology is built upon other subjects, starting with chemistry. Again, then we go into biology, and you guys learned about the cell and the organs and the organ tissues leading up to an organism. And again, ecologists are concerned about the organism, but not ultimately. What it really is when individual beings are interacting with one another. And so it really isn't until we get to the species population level that ecologists start their studies. And from this slide, what you really need to focus on is those definitions from population and above. So population is going to be all one species, but living in one particular place. If you have a group of elephants living in Kenya and a group of elephants living in Zimbabwe and they don't interact, then they're not the same population. The population of Georgia is different than the population of Siberia. So again, you have to be the same species and you have to be in the same space. A level up from that is the community. We know by now that we can't exist without the other living things around us because we are part of a food chain. We are part of a complex food web even. And so the community then, we're going to add in different species that live together and potentially interact. We might not have too much interaction with, say, the squirrels in our backyard, but we're all sharing from the same general resources, especially the abiotic resources. So that's your community. Moving up to the ecosystem. In the ecosystem, we have the biotic and the abiotic, so the living and the non-living. This is where the energy comes into play. So we could have talked about in the community the food chain, but we had no basis for that food chain. We had no sunlight to start out with and provide the initial energy. And remember that the sun is ultimately the source of energy on our planet. And then a level up from there is the biosphere. So all of those systems working together, functioning in one whole thing, one whole entity. And so anytime that we've got an impact to one ecosystem, there's potential that it could affect another ecosystem somewhere else. And that's part of the whole interconnectedness that we study in ecology. Okay, from there we go on to talking about niches. And remember that a niche is the specific role that a species plays in its habitat. And here we've got the graph that shows us what it looks like to be a specialist species versus a generalist species. A specialist species has what we would call a narrow niche, so that red line there for the panda bear shows us that the resource use taken up at the bottom of the graph is much narrower than it is for the raccoon. So that raccoon has a very wide niche breadth. That is the characteristic of generalists versus specialists, is how much niche do they take up? How many resources are they capable of using? Where we see separation, we've got no problem. We've got two separate organisms existing in the same area independently. But where they overlap, that region of overlap, remember, is called competition. And Gauss's principle, the competitive exclusion principle, tells us what's going to happen, which is you cannot share the same niche for very long. One organism is going to have to either adapt, move or migrate, or suffer a population collapse. Maybe it's just a small one, maybe it's an entire population extinction, but you cannot occupy the same area for long. Okay, we talked about different types of species. First one that you see up here is invasive. Another word for that would be non-native or exotic or alien. We don't have a slide for native species, but that's really where we should start out. A native species is one that's supposed to be in an area. All of these are invasive species that we have looked at through case studies. On the top left, you see the abandoned house covered in kudzu. Remember, kudzu was brought here deliberately to help prevent erosion. The bottom left, you see the zebra mussel pictures, and hopefully that diagram not only looks familiar to you from your PowerPoint, but also it should look very familiar from your free response question. Zebra mussels have moved in from Asia. They have taken over many of the waterways that are from the mouth of the Mississippi up to the Great Lakes. You also have some other major trading tributaries like the Hudson River, and they've taken over along there as well. We talked about how they move into isolated lakes and how they can migrate on boats. So there's a lot we learned in the case study about zebra mussels, but it was not on purpose that they were brought here. Nobody really wants them here. They are just a nuisance. Something else we really don't want here. Top right picture, you see the python in the Florida Everglades. I, of course, like this picture because it just looks like something you just don't want to mess with. That python has a deer in its mouth. It is eating a deer whole. Pretty astonishing, but remember that they eat alligators sometimes as well. So things to know about the python, it came here as a pet. It was released deliberately, but unlike the kudzu, the purpose was not to spread pythons. It was really well-meaning people who just could not handle their pets and didn't want them to die. And so this brings about a whole other issue that we'll talk about later, and that's having exotic animals in captivity and what do you do with them. Bottom right hand corner, there's your cane toad. So this one we've been talking about. This is the Bufo marinus. We watched a whole video talking about how it was brought to Australia to eat the cane grub and the cane beetle. The problem was when the toads were around the sugar cane, they weren't doing what the sugar cane grubs were doing, and so they never ended up being a helpful part of that problem. They were never part of the solution. Instead, they have multiplied rapidly. They have great R selection characteristics. For example, they reproduce quickly. They get their legs and they get out of the water before the other frogs, which gives them a jump on them from a predation standpoint. They're also very well adapted to the environment, and that toxin is one thing that the native animals are not used to. So you've got tons of adaptations in the cane toad that have made it a perfect invasive species for Australia. Another type of species that we talked about was an indicator species. Indicator species, really easy to remember, they indicate some type of problem in the environment. And so we've got some examples here listed. One of the pictures from your slides before was the trout. Trout like to live in areas with very high dissolved oxygen, and they like to live in areas that are very cold. And so this can show us that, the types of water in your waterways are very important. It has to have high DO, so it has to be moving. Remember we said in the case study that moving water is going to give you dissolved oxygen. And so moving water is important. Cold temperatures are important. Put that together with what you learn about in your lintic and lotic water systems, and it should be obvious that the source zone of a river is where you would expect to find the trout. Birds were great indicator species for Rachel Carson about pesticide use. Because of the birds, especially the birds of prey being top predators, they were accumulating a lot of these persistent pollutants, which affected their egg quality and sustainability. Butterflies indicate issues with plants. Especially butterflies will indicate when there has been a loss of plants, when there's a loss of other pollinators. Bees and butterflies pollinate the same way. So not only are they indicators, but they are also very important keystone species and very important to our ecosystem services because of their roles as pollinators. And then there's the frogs, and frogs are an incredible indicator species. All amphibians are, because they have part of their life cycle in water, part of their life cycle above ground, so they can show us a lot of environmental issues. Now on the right hand side, I know I showed this picture to my classes. This is the result of frogs that are born into waterways that have been polluted with a chemical pesticide called atrazine. And it's very typical to find a four-legged frog in those areas. Frogs are able to mutate, their DNA is able to mutate so well because of the lack of protection that their eggs have. They are not coated with a shell, they have a soft tissue. And then we come to our keystone species. So I just mentioned that a butterfly and a bee would be examples of keystone species. Without them, we wouldn't have the pollination, and we would definitely suffer some major consequences through the food chain in that area. Keystone species, again, that's the main focus here, is that without these species, you are going to have a potential collapse of your ecosystem. The two that I've picked to put on this slide are both case studies from this unit. You've got a shark and you've got an otter. And again, both of these are keystone because both of them are top predators. Obviously, we can see the shark. We know that it's a top predator. It's going to keep populations in check. It is also just an incredible case study for modern medicine because they do not get cancer. They rarely get sick. So sometimes there's an added benefit to us for keeping these species alive. But what the shark does for nature is it picks off the weak and the struggling individuals, and it ultimately will make its prey population healthier and more viable. Now, what does the otter do? Again, that otter he's such a cute little guy, but what he likes to eat is the sea urchin. And what they found out is in areas where the otters were captured for their skins, the sea urchin population escalated. When it did that, the sea urchin ate the sea kelp. Without the kelp, that was the primary producer in those western waterways up in the Pacific. Without that kelp, the rest of the ecosystem collapsed. And so they found out that they really needed the otter. It was more important than just a cute little creature. It really has a very incredible role. And not only that, but because it is so cute, tourism thrives, and you can restore your fisheries, you can restore your scallops, and things that you would have otherwise thought were sort of contradictory. But the otter helps make it all possible. And we've talked about the bee already, so ecosystem services fall right in line. A lot of these native species to our area help us to maintain proper function, and that's ultimately what an ecosystem service is. It is something provided from nature that helps us to sustain our quality of life. An easy example is the tree. Trees take in carbon dioxide and out comes oxygen. They also, all plants are going to do this, they're also going to take in sunlight and produce for us food. So without plants, there really is nothing else. We can't live here on this planet. Going along with that, we have the bee. You not only had a case study from the book, you had a magazine article and a film about the bee. Bee is an incredible species, so to be so tiny but responsible for so much of the pollination that goes on with especially our food crops. It is an indispensable species. However you might feel about bees, scared of them, not scared of them, we need them. We need them around, and we don't need them addicted to M&M syrup or hummingbird nectar from your hummingbird feeders. And if you're curious about that, you can look it up. They're having a problem in France with honeybees eating the syrup from the M&M factory, and they're making colored honey. But the big problem is if they're getting their sugar from the syrup, they're not getting their sugars from the flower's nectar, and that means they're stopping to do their normal job, which is to pollinate. Bottom picture for ecosystem services, I picked an estuary. Estuaries provide nursing grounds for many fish species, and so you're going to have tons of productivity in here. You've got brackish water, which supports freshwater and saltwater organisms. Wetlands are also going to function as filters for pollutants that might otherwise make their way to the ocean. And so, again, wetlands and estuaries have incredible value to us. Some interactions that take place: interspecific competition, two different species fighting for the same thing; predation, a predator feeds on a prey; parasitism, you've got a positive interaction for one and a negative for the host; mutualism, both species benefit; and commensalism, one is benefited and one is not helped or harmed. Going along with that idea of competition and predator-prey relationships, sometimes you get coevolution, where one species adapts to another species in its surroundings. And so we talked about the moth and the bat as an example of that. Again, parasitism, you've got a host gets hurt, you've got the parasite organism, and that's going to have a benefit. Mutualism, we typically have nutrition protection mutualism, and that's what's happening here. The oxpeckers are getting a nice tasty meal by eating the bugs. The black rhinoceros gets protected from diseases that the bugs might carry. And commensalism, neither helped nor hurt. You've got a bromeliad growing on the tree, not in the tree, not rooting in the tree. It is not hurt whatsoever. And that's the end of part 4.